Under the pale gaze of a full moon, Henry Whitlock trudged into the desolate graveyard, his lantern trembling in his frail hands. Midnight's icy breath chilled his bones, but grief propelled him forward. For 20 years, he had visited this place on his late son Nathan's birthday. But this night was different. As the church bell struck 12, the earth quivered, and a voice, faint yet familiar, whispered, "Father, why did you leave me?" He froze, heart pounding, as something moved among the graves, something that should never exist. Henry Whitlock sat alone in the dim light of his study, a room that had become a prison of his own making. The walls were lined with books he no longer read, their spines gathering dust like memories he tried to suppress. A photograph sat on the desk before him, its edges worn from years of being held. It was a picture of his son, Nathan, taken on his 5th birthday. In the image, Nathan grinned widely, holding up a toy train as if it were the greatest treasure in the world. The train had been Henry's gift to his son, a symbol of the bond they once shared. But that bond had been severed 20 years ago on a day Henry could never forget. Nathan's death had been sudden and tragic, a cruel twist of fate that left Henry and his wife, Margaret, shattered. Margaret passed away a few years later, unable to bear the weight of her grief. Now, Henry was alone, his life reduced to repetitive days and sleepless nights. Every year on Nathan's birthday, Henry visited his son's grave. It had become a ritual, a way to keep his son's memory alive. He would bring a single white lily, Nathan's favorite flower, and sit by the grave, speaking to the boy as if he were still alive. The ritual brought him no comfort, only a fleeting sense of connection to the child he had lost. This year was different. Henry had been having vivid dreams where Nathan called out to him, begging for help. The dreams were so real, so intense that Henry often woke in a cold sweat, his son's voice echoing in his ears. It felt as if Nathan were trying to reach him from beyond the grave. Adding to his unease was the note he found on his doorstep a week before. Written in shaky handwriting, it read, "Do not come to the graveyard on Nathan's birthday. You will regret it." There was no signature or clue about who left it. At first, Henry thought it was a cruel prank, but the note weighed heavily on his mind. Despite the warning, Henry couldn't stay away. The graveyard was the only place where he felt close to Nathan, the only place where he could still pretend, even for a moment, that his son was with him. As midnight approached, Henry prepared himself. He dressed warmly, the October chill cutting through his frail frame. He grabbed his lantern and the white lily he had picked earlier. The walk to the graveyard was somber. The streets were empty, the houses dark. The only sound was the crunch of fallen leaves under Henry's feet. The closer he got, the heavier the air seemed to become, as if the world itself were mourning. When he arrived, the gate creaked open with a sound that made Henry shiver. The graveyard was eerily silent, the kind of silence that felt alive, as if the place were holding its breath. The moon hung low, casting long shadows that seemed to dance among the tombstones. Henry made his way to Nathan's grave, his footsteps slow and deliberate. When he reached it, he knelt and placed the lily on the headstone. "Happy birthday, Nathan," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I miss you every day." As he sat there, the wind picked up, carrying a faint sound. At first, Henry thought it was just the rustling of leaves, but then he heard it again. A voice, soft and distant, calling his name. "Father." Henry froze, his heart pounding. He looked around, but the graveyard was empty. The voice came again, louder this time. "Father, why did you leave me?" Fear and hope clashed within Henry as he stood, his lantern trembling in his hand. "Nathan," he called out, his voice barely audible. "Is that you?" The wind answered with a chilling howl, and in the shadows something moved. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but Henry saw it. A figure, small and childlike, standing among the tombstones. His breath caught as he took a hesitant step forward. "Nathan." The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, watching him. Henry's mind raced. Was he imagining things? Was his grief playing tricks on him? Or had his son truly found a way to reach him? Driven by desperation, Henry moved closer. But as he did, the figure began to change. Its outline blurred, its features shifting into something unnatural. Henry stopped, his lantern shaking so violently that its light flickered. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice cracking. The figure stepped forward, and Henry's blood ran cold. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "You shouldn't have come," it said, its voice a distorted echo of Nathan's. "Now, you'll never leave." Before Henry could react, the ground beneath him began to tremble, and chilling laughter echoed through the graveyard. The figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving Henry alone and terrified. He turned to run, but the path he had come down was no longer there. The graveyard seemed to stretch endlessly, a labyrinth of tombstones and darkness. Henry clutched his lantern, the only source of light in an ever-growing abyss. "Nathan," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The wind carried his words into the night, and for a brief moment the laughter stopped. But the silence that followed was even more terrifying, for it was the silence of something watching, waiting. Henry realized then that he was no longer alone in the graveyard, and whatever was with him wasn't human. The chill of the graveyard seeped into Henry's bones as he stood frozen in place, his eyes locked on the spot where the grotesque figure had dissolved into the shadows. He gripped his lantern tighter, its fragile glow casting jittery patterns on the headstones around him. The once familiar graveyard now felt foreign, twisted as if it were alive and aware of his presence. "Nathan," he whispered again, though the name now felt like a question rather than a plea. The silence that followed was oppressive, bearing down on him like a weight he could not shrug off. The graveyard's usual serenity had given way to an unnatural stillness that made his skin crawl. Henry's instincts screamed at him to leave, but the path back to the gate had vanished, replaced by rows of headstones he didn't recognize. He turned in circles, the lantern's glow revealing strange carvings on the tombstones, symbols and letters he couldn't decipher. Some of the stones bore no names at all, only smooth, blank surfaces that seemed to absorb the light. "Think, Henry," he muttered, his voice shaky. "You've been here 100 times. You know this place." But even as he said the words, they rang hollow. The graveyard seemed to stretch endlessly now, a labyrinth designed to confuse and trap him. The air grew heavier with each passing moment, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. He took a tentative step forward, his boots crunching against gravel that seemed unnervingly loud in the oppressive silence. The lantern's flame flickered, threatening to go out, and Henry's pulse quickened. He couldn't afford to lose the only light he had. Clutching it tightly, he began to walk, his steps uncertain but deliberate. As he moved deeper into the graveyard, the wind picked up again, carrying faint whispers that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The voices were indistinct, like a crowd murmuring just out of earshot. He couldn't make out any words, but their tone was unsettling, accusatory, angry, and cold. "Nathan," he called again, his voice cracking. "If you're here, show yourself." The whispers grew louder, blending into a cacophony that seemed to echo from every direction. Henry spun around, trying to locate the source, but the voices were everywhere and nowhere. His lantern shook in his trembling hand, casting erratic shadows that danced like specters on the gravestones. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement, a flicker of something darting between the headstones. He turned sharply, raising the lantern, but whatever it was had already vanished. His heart raced as he scanned the area, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice wavering. "Show yourself." The laughter returned, low and mocking, rolling through the graveyard like distant thunder. It wasn't a child's laughter this time. It was deeper, more guttural, and it sent a shiver down Henry's spine. He staggered backward, nearly tripping over an uneven patch of ground. As he steadied himself, he noticed something ahead, a faint glow emanating from behind a cluster of jagged headstones. It pulsed softly, like the light of a dying ember, and Henry felt an inexplicable pull toward it. Against his better judgment, he moved closer. When he rounded the headstones, he froze. In the center of a small clearing stood a massive oak tree, its gnarled branches reaching skyward like skeletal arms. At its base was an open grave, freshly dug, the soil piled neatly to one side. The faint glow came from within the grave, its source obscured by shadows. Henry's breath caught as he stepped closer, peering into the grave. What he saw made his blood run cold. Lying at the bottom was a coffin, its lid slightly ajar. The glow emanated from inside, casting an eerie light on the edges of the wooden box. Carved into the coffin's lid was a name, Henry Whitlock. He stumbled back, his legs weak beneath him. No, this isn't real, he stammered, shaking his head. This can't be real. The wind howled and the whispers returned, louder and more distinct. This time he could make out fragments of words. Why? Come. Not welcome. Henry clutched his chest, his heart pounding. The graveyard seemed to close in around him, the trees and tombstones leaning closer as if to watch. He turned to run, but his path was blocked by the same grotesque figure that had vanished earlier. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its glowing eyes fixed on him. "You don't belong here," the figure said, its voice a distorted growl. "You shouldn't have come." Henry took a shaky step back, his mind racing. "What do you want from me?" he cried, his voice breaking. The figure tilted its head, its twisted smile widening. "You came looking for answers," it said, "but the answers you seek will cost you more than you're willing to pay." Henry shook his head, panic rising. "I just want to see my son," he pleaded. "I just want to know he's at peace." The figure's smile faded, replaced by an expression of mock pity. "Your son," it said, its tone dripping with malice. "He's waiting for you, but not where you think." Before Henry could respond, the ground beneath him gave way and he plunged into darkness. The last thing he saw was the figure's glowing eyes, watching him as he fell. Henry's descent felt endless. The sensation of falling was disorienting, the darkness around him so complete it seemed to press against his skin. The lantern slipped from his grasp and vanished into the void, its faint light extinguished. His body tensed, bracing for an impact that never came. When he finally stopped falling, it wasn't a sudden jolt, but a gradual slowing, as though unseen hands had gently placed him onto solid ground. He gasped for air, his chest heaving, the acrid stench of damp earth filling his nostrils. The darkness began to recede, not from any source of light but from an unsettling clarity that revealed his surroundings. He was no longer in the graveyard. Around him stretched an expanse of barren, desolate earth, dotted with jagged rocks and patches of withered grass. The sky above was a sickly gray, featureless and oppressive. The air was thick, making each breath a struggle. In the distance, Henry could make out the silhouettes of crooked trees, their bare branches clawing at the sky. A sound broke the silence, a low, rhythmic thudding that seemed to echo from beneath the ground. It was faint at first, but grew louder with each passing moment, the vibrations reverberating through the soles of his boots. Henry turned in circles, his heart racing, but he could see no source for the noise. Then, far ahead, he noticed a figure. It was small and hunched, moving slowly across the barren land. Henry squinted, his pulse quickening as recognition struck him. "Nathan," he called, his voice hoarse and weak. The figure paused, its head tilting slightly before resuming its shuffle. "Nathan!" Henry shouted, his desperation giving him strength. He broke into a run, his legs trembling beneath him. The figure didn't turn or acknowledge him, but Henry was certain it was his son. The way it moved, the slight slump of its shoulders, It had to be him. As he closed the distance, the ground beneath him began to shift, soft and unsteady like wet sand. Henry stumbled but pressed on, his focus fixed on the figure ahead. "Nathan, wait, it's me." Finally, he was close enough to see the figure more clearly. His heart sank. It wasn't Nathan. The figure turned to face him, revealing a face that was almost human but horribly distorted. Its eyes were sunken and black, its skin pale and stretched tight over its skull. Henry stumbled back, his breath hitching. "You're not my son," he whispered. The creature tilted its head, its grin widening. "Your son is here," it said, its voice a raspy whisper. "But you must go further to find him." Before Henry could respond, the creature turned and began to move again, its hunched frame disappearing into the mist. Henry hesitated, his body trembling. The creature's words echoed in his mind. "Your son is here." Against his better judgment, he followed. The mist thickened as he walked, clinging to his skin like a cold, damp shroud. The rhythmic thudding grew louder, the vibrations more intense. Henry's surroundings became harder to distinguish, dissolving into a hazy expanse. Eventually, the mist began to clear, revealing a massive structure ahead. It was a towering, ancient building, its surface covered in dark, pulsating veins. The sight of it made Henry's stomach churn, but he couldn't turn back. If Nathan was inside, he had to find him. As he approached, a massive door loomed before him, its surface carved with intricate, otherworldly patterns. The rhythmic thudding was louder now, coming from within the structure. Henry pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, revealing a cavernous interior lit by a sickly green light. The walls were lined with countless alcoves, each holding a coffin. The thudding sound came from the center of the room, where a massive, black heart hung suspended by thick veins. Henry's breath caught in his throat as he stepped inside. The air was suffocating, heavy with the stench of decay. The heart pulsed rhythmically, each beat vibrating through the very walls. "Nathan," Henry whispered, "are you here?" A faint sound reached his ears, a child's voice, weak and distant. "Father." Henry's eyes widened and he rushed toward the source of the voice. It came from one of the alcoves, where a small coffin lay partially open. He hesitated, his hands trembling as he reached for the lid. Slowly, he pushed it open. Inside was Nathan, but he was not the boy Henry remembered. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were sunken. He looked up at Henry with an expression of sorrow and fear. "Father," Nathan said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you shouldn't have come." Henry's heart shattered. "I'm here to save you," he said, tears streaming down his face. "I'll take you home." Nathan shook his head slowly. "It's too late," he said. "You can't save me, but you can still leave, before it takes you too." Before Henry could respond, the ground beneath him trembled violently, and the massive heart in the center of the room began to beat faster. A deafening roar filled the air, and the pulsating veins along the walls writhed like living things. The creature from before appeared in the doorway, its twisted grin more menacing than ever. "You've seen enough," it said. "Now you must decide. Stay and face the truth, or leave and forget." Henry clutched Nathan's frail body, his mind racing. He couldn't leave, not without his son. Henry's grip on Nathan tightened as the pulsating veins along the walls stretched toward him, their movements disturbingly lifelike. The massive black heart at the room's center beat faster, its thunderous rhythm shaking the ground beneath his feet. Each pulse sent waves of nausea through Henry, as though the very air had turned toxic. The creature in the doorway tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. "You cling to what you cannot save," it hissed, its guttural voice making Henry's skin crawl. "You still think you have a choice." "I do," Henry shot back, his voice cracking. "I'll take my son, and we'll leave this place." The creature's grin widened, revealing jagged, yellowed teeth. "You don't understand," it said. "He is already part of this. He belongs to this." Nathan stirred in Henry's arms, his frail body trembling. "Father," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You should have left. It's too late." "No," Henry said, tears forming. "I won't leave you here, not like this." The room trembled violently, and a guttural roar filled the air. The black heart pulsed faster, its veiny tendrils writhing like serpents. Henry turned, watching as the alcoves along the walls cracked open. Twisted, malformed figures emerged, their hollow eyes glowing faintly, skeletal limbs moving unnaturally. Their faces were distorted masks of agony, their guttural moans piercing the oppressive silence. Henry's heart pounded as he staggered backward, clutching Nathan. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice shaking. The creature stepped closer, deliberate in its movements. "This is the price of seeking the truth," it said. "You came looking for your son, but you found more than you bargained for." The malformed figures closed in, rasping breaths and guttural growls filling the air. Henry's instincts screamed at him to run, but the doorway was blocked and the room itself warped, trapping him. The walls seemed to pulse in sync with the heart, their grotesque, fleshy surfaces closing in on him. "Father," Nathan whispered again, "it's too late for me." "No," Henry shouted, shaking his head. "I'll fight for you." The creature let out a mocking laugh. "Fight? Against this?" It gestured to the writhing tendrils and advancing malformed figures. "You cannot fight what you do not understand. You should have stayed away." Henry's mind raced. The black heart's deafening rhythm bore down on him, and the tendrils inched closer, predatory in their movements. The malformed figures moved with eerie precision, their skeletal hands reaching out to him and Nathan. Suddenly, Nathan touched Henry's face, his sunken eyes meeting his father's. For a moment, there was a flicker of the boy Henry remembered, a glimmer of innocence buried beneath layers of despair. "Father," Nathan said softly, "you need to leave. If you stay, it will take you too." Henry shook his head, tears streaming. "I can't leave you here," he said. "I won't." Nathan's expression darkened. "You have to go," he cried. "It's too late for me. If you stay, it will claim you too." The malformed figures were just feet away, skeletal hands reaching. The tendrils coiled around Henry's legs, cold and slimy. He felt his strength draining, as though life itself was being sucked from him. The air grew heavier, each breath feeling like it could be his last. The creature laughed again, its voice echoing. "You see now," it said. "There is no escape. You belong to this place." Henry's grip on Nathan tightened as he struggled. "I won't let this happen," he shouted. "You can't take us." Nathan's hand slipped from Henry's face. "Father," he said quietly, "it's not your fight anymore." Before Henry could respond, the black heart roared, and the room was engulfed in blinding green light. Henry felt himself pulled backward, as though an invisible force was dragging him away from Nathan. He screamed, reaching out, but his fingers grasped only air. "Nathan!" he cried. "No! I won't leave you!" Nathan's figure faded into the light. "You have to go," he said one last time, his voice echoing faintly. "Live. For both of us." Henry's vision blurred as the light grew brighter. The malformed figures and tendrils dissolved, and the last thing Henry saw was the black heart shattering into countless fragments, its energy dissipating into the void. When the light faded, Henry found himself lying on the cold, damp graveyard ground. The lantern he had dropped earlier lay nearby, its faint glow casting long shadows. His body ached, and his clothes were damp with sweat and dirt. Henry sat up slowly, his mind reeling. The graveyard was silent, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves. "Nathan," he whispered, his voice trembling. Tears streamed down his face as he clutched his chest, the weight of his loss pressing down on him. He scanned the horizon, hoping for a sign of his son, but the graveyard offered no answers. For a moment, he thought he heard a faint whisper on the wind. Live. For both of us. Henry closed his eyes, his body racked with sobs. Slowly, he picked up the lantern and began to make his way out of the graveyard, his steps heavy with grief but driven by a faint glimmer of hope. The path ahead was uncertain, but he knew he had to honor his son's final words. Henry trudged through the overgrown pathway leading out of the graveyard, his lantern barely illuminating the way. Each step felt heavier than the last, his body burdened by exhaustion and grief. The faint whisper he had heard earlier echoed in his mind. Live. For both of us. It was the only thing that kept him moving forward. The night seemed darker now, the world unnaturally quiet. Even the rustling of leaves had ceased, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. The graveyard gates creaked as he pushed them open, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. Henry paused, glancing back at the towering mausoleum where he had faced the monstrous heart. Its dark silhouette loomed against the foggy horizon. He forced himself to turn away. The dirt road leading back to town felt unfamiliar. The trees on either side were taller, their branches intertwining into a suffocating canopy overhead. The lantern's flickering glow cast fleeting shadows, each movement making him flinch. Just keep walking, Henry muttered, his voice trembling. It's just the darkness playing tricks. The air grew colder, biting through his coat. Fog began to creep in, swirling around his feet and slowly rising, obscuring the path. Henry's pulse quickened as he realized he could no longer see more than a few steps ahead. Panic threatened to take hold, but he tightened his grip on the lantern and pressed on. A sudden rustling behind him made Henry freeze. It was faint at first, like leaves disturbed by a gentle breeze. But there was no wind. Slowly, the sound grew louder, deliberate, as if something, or someone, was moving through the fog. Henry's breath caught in his throat. He turned, holding the lantern high, but the dense mist swallowed the light, revealing nothing. "Who's there?" he called, his voice cracking. The rustling stopped, replaced by silence. Then, from the depths of the fog, a low, guttural growl emerged. Henry's blood ran cold. The growl was unlike anything he had ever heard, deep, primal, and menacing. It reverberated through his very bones. He stepped back, gripping the lantern tighter. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice trembling. He swung the lantern in front of him, the flame flickering violently as though reacting to the unseen predator. The growl intensified, followed by heavy, deliberate footsteps. Henry's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. His heart pounded as a massive shadow began to take shape within the fog. Its form shifted and twisted unnaturally as it moved closer. Henry stumbled backward, his foot catching on a root. He fell hard to the ground, the lantern slipping from his grasp and rolling a few feet away. Its light cast erratic beams, briefly illuminating the creature, a grotesque amalgamation of limbs and faces, its countless soulless eyes locking onto him. Scrambling to his feet, Henry grabbed the lantern and swung it wildly. The creature recoiled slightly, its distorted form writhing in discomfort, but it did not retreat. Instead, it began to circle him, slow and deliberate, as though savoring his fear. "What do you want?" Henry screamed. The creature let out a deafening roar, a sound so powerful it seemed to shake the very ground. Henry's vision blurred, his ears ringing from the force of it. In that moment, a memory flashed through his mind. Nathan's voice, soft and pleading. "Live. For both of us." The words ignited a spark of defiance within him. He couldn't let this thing claim him. Not here. Not now. With newfound determination, Henry swung the lantern again, aiming for the creature's many eyes. The light burned it, and the creature let out an ear-splitting screech, recoiling further. Seizing the opportunity, Henry turned and ran, his legs fueled by sheer adrenaline. The fog seemed to close in, but he didn't stop. weaving through twisted trees and uneven terrain. The growls and footsteps pursued him, relentless and unyielding. Henry's lungs burned, his legs screamed for rest, but he pushed on. Ahead, a faint light broke through the fog, a warm, golden glow that cut through the darkness. "Help!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Please, someone help me." The light grew closer, and Henry realized it was coming from a small wooden cabin, its windows glowing invitingly. He didn't question its presence. He simply ran toward it, his only thought to reach safety. As he burst through the cabin door, he slammed it shut behind him, collapsing to the floor in exhaustion. The growls outside grew louder, accompanied by the sound of claws scraping against the wooden walls. Henry grabbed a chair and propped it against the door, his hands trembling. The cabin was modest, its interior lit by a single oil lamp on a wooden table. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. For a moment, Henry allowed himself to breathe, his heart still racing. But his relief was short-lived. From the corner of the room, a voice spoke, low and familiar. "You shouldn't have come here." Henry's head snapped toward the sound, his blood running cold. In the shadows, a figure emerged, one he thought he'd never see again. "Nathan?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The boy stepped into the light, his hollow eyes unrecognizable. "It's not over, Father," Nathan said, his voice echoing with an otherworldly resonance. "You've only just begun." Henry froze, his mind unable to process the sight before him. Nathan stood just a few feet away, illuminated by the flickering light of the cabin's single oil lamp. But this wasn't the Nathan he remembered. The boy's face was hollow, his eyes dark voids that seemed to pull at Henry's very soul. His voice, when he spoke, carried an eerie resonance, as if multiple voices spoke in unison. "It's time, Father," Nathan said, his expression devoid of emotion. "You shouldn't have come back." Henry's knees buckled and he leaned against the door for support. "Nathan," he whispered, his voice trembling. What has happened to you?" Nathan took a step forward, his movement slow and deliberate. "This place," he said, gesturing to the cabin. "It's not real. It never was. You've been walking through its illusion since the moment you entered the graveyard." Henry's breath hitched. He glanced around the cabin, and suddenly, the room felt less solid, as though it were swaying or dissolving at the edges. The warmth from the fire no longer reached him, and the shadows cast by the dancing flames seemed to twist unnaturally. "I came to find you," Henry stammered, tears streaming down his face. "I couldn't leave you there. I had to bring you home." Nathan tilted his head, his hollow eyes narrowing. "Home?" he repeated, a trace of mockery in his tone. "There is no home for me anymore. I belong to this place now, and you have invited it into yourself by coming here." Henry shook his head, his hands clutching at his chest as panic clawed at his insides. "No," he whispered. "No, I won't let it take me. I won't let it take you." Nathan's lips curved into a faint, eerie smile. "You've already made the choice," he said. "It's not about what you want anymore. It's about what it wants." As he spoke, the walls of the cabin began to shift and distort. The wooden planks twisted like living flesh, the cracks between them oozing a black, tar-like substance. The fire in the hearth flickered violently before snuffing out entirely, plunging the room into near darkness. The only light came from the lantern still clutched in Henry's trembling hands. "Fight it," Henry pleaded, his voice breaking. "You're stronger than this, Nathan. I know you are." Nathan didn't respond. Instead, his form began to change. His arms elongated, his fingers sharpening into claw-like appendages. His face twisted into something unrecognizable, a grotesque mask of human and inhuman features. The hollow voids where his eyes had been now burned with an intense, otherworldly light. The cabin's walls began to close in, the oozing black substance spreading across the floor and ceiling. The sound of distant growls and whispers filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. Henry's lantern flickered, its light dimming under the oppressive darkness. "I'm sorry, Father," Nathan's voice echoed, now distorted and guttural. "But you were never meant to save me." Henry's heart shattered. "No," he cried, stepping toward his son. "I won't leave you again. If this place wants me, it can have me, but not you." As he reached out, the lantern in his hand flared brightly, its light momentarily piercing through the suffocating darkness. Nathan recoiled, his monstrous form writhing under the intense glow. For a brief moment, Henry thought he saw a flicker of the boy he once knew, trapped beneath the surface of the creature. "Nathan!" Henry shouted, holding the lantern higher. "Come back to me! Fight it!" The light from the lantern grew brighter, its warmth cutting through the cold void that had consumed the room. Nathan let out a guttural scream, his form convulsing violently. The black substance covering the walls began to recede, and the oppressive growls and whispers faded into silence. For a moment, everything was still. Nathan collapsed to the ground, his body returning to its human form. Henry dropped the lantern and fell to his knees beside him, pulling the boy into his arms. "I've got you," Henry whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You're safe now." Nathan opened his eyes, and for the first time, they were clear. "Father," he said weakly, tears streaming down his face, I'm sorry." Before Henry could respond, the cabin began to shake violently. The walls cracked and splintered, and a blinding light filled the room. Henry held Nathan tightly as the world around them disintegrated into nothingness. When Henry opened his eyes, he found himself lying on the cold, damp ground of the graveyard. The lantern lay beside him, its flame extinguished. Nathan was gone. Henry sat up, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had lost. He looked around, half expecting to see the twisted creature or the pulsating heart, but the graveyard was silent. The mausoleum stood in the distance, its door closed as if nothing had ever happened. A faint breeze rustled the leaves, carrying with it a soft, familiar whisper. "Live. For both of us." Henry closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face. He didn't know how he would move forward, but he knew he had to. Slowly, he picked up the lantern and began to make his way out of the graveyard, his steps heavy with grief but guided by the faintest glimmer of hope.